Well, I wore blue today for Super Bowl Sunday, solidarity with the Lions. I am starting this. If you would all join me, if we could get over 100 people to do this, we might cause a trend on the internet. But let's just do hashtag not my Super Bowl, right? I mean, nobody's excited about it tonight. We're all going to suffer a few hours tonight if you decide to watch that. But I wouldn't blame you if you don't. Well, that caused a little bit of commotion, I guess. We're going to get to the word now. Have you ever looked back at a picture and wondered, what on earth was I doing? Maybe it was the fashion choices. Maybe it was the baggy jeans or the frosted tips, the questionable color combinations. You know, I think if you don't have those photos, you didn't take pictures in middle school. But maybe for you, it was a journal entry, where if you could look back years later with some hindsight and you looked at maybe what you were journaling and you thought, wow, in that moment, that felt like it was such a big deal to me, but now it just never even registers for you, right? Do you think about the things that felt so weighty for a time that now don't even give any headspace to? Perspective changes everything. It really does. What once felt massive now seems small. What used to consume your thoughts now barely registers. And Job here, as we get to chapter 38, I know we've jumped a lot. We're just going to kind of miss a lot of repetitive belly aching. But he's in the middle of his storm. And from his vantage point, everything feels like it's crumbling. And he has questions. He has big questions for God, like, why am I suffering, God? Why do you seem silent? Why does life feel so unfair? Those are big questions, difficult questions. And then, in the midst of all of his questions, in the midst of all of his angst, God speaks. And really, for me, the hinge of our series, the reason why we called it Wounds and Wisdom, lands right here. For 37 chapters, Job gets to focus on his wounds, and today, God's going to shift Job's perspective and say, why don't you look at my wisdom? For 37 chapters, it's wounds, 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 and they're real wounds. They're not insignificant wounds. For most of us, we could look at what happens in Job's life and say, "Oh, that's unimaginable. I can't even fathom that kind of loss." And here, Job, after pleading with God, God speaks. But I want you to see the height of Job's frustration towards God. This is from Job 23. This is the first 7 verses. Then Job spoke again. My complaint today is still a bitter one, and I try hard not to groan aloud. If only I knew where to find God, I would go to his court. I would lay out my case and present my arguments. Then I would listen to his reply and understand what he says to me. Would he use his great power to argue with me? No, he would give me a fair hearing. Honest people can reason with him, so I would be forever acquitted by my judge. Wow, Job says, man, if I could just find him. God, where are you hiding out? I go to the east, I can't find you. I go to the west, I can't find you. Everywhere I'm looking for you, you seem to not be there. But if I just had the opportunity, oh man, I would love to go to court with God. I would love to display my case. And at the end, once the judge got to see my case and God's case, the judge would go, yeah, Job, you're acquitted. That's how frustrated he is with God in this moment. He believes God has wrongfully allowed these things to happen. He thinks God is not being fair. And so Job is looking for God, looking to present his case, and he really believes that if given the opportunity, he would win. But here's the beautiful thing about the book of Job is that we do get to see Job stand before the Lord, and we do get to hear from the Lord, and the Lord present his case. A little bit of Bible trivia from chapter 38 to 41. It is the longest time God the Father speaks in the whole Bible. It is the longest discourse that you get to see from Yahweh, and it finds itself in a book about a man who's lost everything, who's gone through unimaginable suffering. And so there's those times where we feel like God's absent in suffering, and yet if we go to the Word of God, he's never more present. Right, he's here and he responds to Job, but instead of an explanation, God gives Job a new perspective. Not by answering his questions. It wasn't like God rolled it all out and said, hey, did you see this is why I was doing that? And hey, that's how that dot connects. No, he doesn't do that. Instead, rather than answering the question, he overwhelms Job with the reality of who he is. And so in Job 38, God launches in through a series of questions, question after question, that shake Job to his core. Questions about creation, about the foundation of the earth, about the boundaries of the sea, about the expanse of the universe. It's like, wait, Job probably, in this moment, Job has to feel small, doesn't he? And of all the calling out and saying, God, would you just make sense of this? Why? Why me? Why this? Why now? And then God enters in not to answer the why question, but he says, Job, this is who I am. And so from our passage today, there's three things I want us to see, is that God's wisdom is beyond us. That the vastness of creation reminds us of our own limitations, our own limits, and just how small we are. And then we're going to look at how God's power is over us. That the one who commands the sea commands our storms too. And lastly, that God's presence is with us. That he doesn't just thunder from the storm, but he speaks through it. And so by the end, I want to show how all of this points forward to Jesus, because the wisdom of Job 38 finds its fulfillment in him. And so before we dive in, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. What do you do when life doesn't make sense? I'd imagine some of you in here right now, you could even say, hey, the whatever I'm walking through doesn't make sense. I'm doing all the right things. I'm praying all the right things. I'm asking all the right things, and yet God either seems to be silent or my life doesn't seem to add up. There's times when your suffering feels like it has no purpose, doesn't it? Just me? No, there's times where suffering doesn't make sense. There's times where heaven seems quiet, like where you're in a room and you're praying and you're just calling out to the Lord. But if you could just be honest, there's times where it feels like as you're projecting up, as you're looking up, as you're calling out to him, it feels like somehow the ceiling has a way of slamming your prayer back down. Where it's like, did it even escape? Did God even hear? There's those times where we pray that way, and when no answer comes, it feels easy to feel abandoned. To assume that if God isn't explaining, if stuff's not magically starting to make sense, well then the natural dot that I connect is that he's not explaining, then he's not caring. And some of us, we make that connection, and I'm telling you from the Word of God, that's not a fair connection. Because what if, just what if, wisdom isn't something we're supposed to fully grasp? What if there's this idea of James that if a man were to lack wisdom, that he could ask God and God would give it to him in abundance? That wisdom is something you can gain more of, but is it something we can fully grasp? What if it was something that we're supposed to trust? What if wisdom is something we're supposed to trust? What if the fact that we don't understand is proof that we're not meant to? Because if we could wrap our minds around God and why God does the things that he does every time that he does, he wouldn't be God. He'd just be a slightly smarter version of us. Right? If we could just, okay, yes, God, you make sense, or that dot connects for me. Okay, well, you're just a little bit smarter than me. The moment you think you've outgrown mystery, you've outgrown faith. If your theology doesn't allow for some mystery, you have bad theology. If God just completely makes sense to you, then your God's finite. And there's something to be said about the finite mind not being able to comprehend the infinite God. And so the call isn't for clarity from the Word of God, it's to trust. Trust that, hey God, you're bigger than me, you're wiser than me, you're smarter than me, and I trust you. Even if what you have given me or what you've allowed to come into my life isn't what I would have chosen for me. And so this passage reminds us that wisdom is not just about information. It's also about perspective. That God has a different perspective than we. It's not just that he has different information than we do, he does. But he also has a different perspective than we do. And so it's about shifting our focus from demanding explanations to the trusting the one who holds it all and has it all. And Job 38 shows us that God doesn't always just answer with knowledge, but he answers with himself. You know, when I can look back at my own seasons of suffering in life, it wasn't like in those moments where it was like, oh yeah, all the dots connect, this makes sense. But I can also look back at the most difficult seasons of my life and say, I never experienced more closeness and intimacy with him. There was something about the shepherd that was closer to me in the valley than in other areas of life. And I'm not much about a shepherd. I grew up in Warren, Michigan, but I'm telling you this, what I've read is that sheep are never as close to the shepherd than when they're in the valley. And sometimes we go through a valley and you will experience more of an intimacy with God than you could anywhere else. And so God takes Job from focusing on his wounds and gives him here an invitation into his wisdom. And so God's wisdom is beyond us. That's verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? This is God's first question. And let's just be real, it's not a question. That's a mic drop. When Job's like, man, if you could just let me at you, if I could just present my case, and if I could share with you all that I know, and you shared with what you know, then we allow other people to speak into it. They're going to say, I'm right, you're wrong. And so finally, when God decides to speak, he says, hey, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Boom. I mean, who is man that he could even respond to a question like that from God? Right. God just showed him his vastness. He just said, hey, we're not just kind of different. We're entirely different. My ways are so beyond your ways, Job. And so this is just the first question. I mean, God's going to go through a series of questions. And so God takes Job on a tour of creation as you follow Job 38. The earth's foundation, the morning stars singing. I wonder what that sounded like. The gates of the sea flinging open. And the whole point is, Job, you weren't there. You weren't there. You don't see what I see. You've come into the story way late in the game, brother. You don't even remember chapter 1, when I was laying the foundations of the earth. Any Lord of the Rings nerds here? I don't call them fans, you're nerds. It would be like trying to watch the 9 hours, 10 hours of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and then maybe 9, 10 hours of the Hobbit. But it would be like catching 6 seconds of the Twin Tower, or not the Twin Tower, Two Towers. Thank you, nerds. Be like going into 6 seconds of the Two Towers and saying, hey, Peter Jackson, here's how you should have directed the film differently. It's like, hey, you got this little glimmer, you got this little glimpse of the story, and now you're trying to judge the whole picture. That's what Job does here. He comes in with such a limited perspective. And God's reminding him that, hey, Job, you must not have been there when I was there at the very beginning. Because, man, when those morning stars sang, he said, you don't understand how beautiful of a melody that was. God's calling Job to recognize his limitations, not to shame him, but to reorient him. Job has spent so many chapters pleading his case, presenting his justice, demanding explanations, and now God essentially says, Job, you're assuming that you see all that there is to see. But what if there's far more to the picture than you realize? The imagery here God uses is striking. He describes the foundation of the earth as some massive architectural project that had careful design. He speaks of the morning stars singing together, this poetic depiction of the beauty of creation, the cosmic joy that was happening. And he talks about the setting of the boundaries of the sea as if he were a parent teaching a child where they needed to stop. And so every word is just dripping with the intentionality of God's wisdom. He says, Job, you just don't know. And I can't explain it to you. Your mind couldn't even fathom it. And here's what God is saying to Job. Creation itself testifies to the fact that I see farther, I know deeper, and I'm working in ways that you can't comprehend. In modern philosophy, there's this thing called epistemic humility, the idea that we should recognize our own limitations of our own knowledge. And if there was ever a time for epistemic humility, it's here in this moment where Job is standing before the creator of the universe, and he is letting Job know, you don't know it all. You don't know it all. There's things that are beyond you. And so think about this. What does it mean to believe in a God whose wisdom transcends ours? Isn't that what the Bible teaches? That his wisdom transcends our wisdom, and it means then by definition there will be things about his plans, his ways, his timing that we cannot understand because we're not just a little bit different. There's a huge distinction between the two of us, between the creator and the created. And so it means that if we could fully comprehend everything God does, then he wouldn't be God. Imagine, I remember as a kid bombarding my dad during tax season, and he was doing his taxes, and I think I was just annoying him, and I think he was like, hey, count out to 100, you'll like get money for doing this. And so I'm like writing out to 100, and but I can remember times where I looked at my parents and it just seemed like whatever the financial situation was, it was kind of stressful figuring out taxes and bills and things. And just with my limited knowledge and my limited wisdom, it was like, why can't I have more toys? We're the 5-year-old. We're the 5-year-old sitting at the table, looking to God, saying, why don't I have more stuff? Or why isn't it all figured out? Why isn't it the way that I want it to be? And we don't have the full picture of how it works. And so the wisdom gap between us and God isn't like the wisdom gap between a parent and a child. It's the gap between the finite and the infinite, between dust and divinity, between created and creator. This is what the prophet Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. My thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, says the Lord, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. It's why we get called to trust. Isn't that what the Proverbs verse 3, verse 5 says? It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And we have to be careful here, because sometimes you get people that hey, we want to have this great faith, and we want a faith that just isn't even wise at times. Well, the Proverbs doesn't call us to lean on no understanding. It calls us to lean on a different understanding, one that's higher than ours. And so it's about trusting. And so God's wisdom isn't just something we struggle to grasp, it's something we can't even fathom. And so we need to properly understand that. It's higher than us. It's beyond us. That's why the Bible often compares it to that God's wisdom is something unsearchable. This is what gets echoed in the New Testament in Romans 11:33. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. His wisdom is beyond us, and our invitation is to trust that. And the beauty is not only is his wisdom beyond us, but his power is over us. Look with me at verse 8. Who kept the sea inside its boundaries as it burst from the womb? We've talked about this before, but the sea in this kind of ancient culture was a symbol of chaos. It was unpredictable, it was untamable, it was feared. It's kind of why in Matthew 14, when Peter steps out on the boat in the Sea of Galilee, there was this immense trust that hey, to go into the deep of the sea was to go into this dark abyss. You know, it was something that was truly scary. And so the ancient Near East people believed the sea represented disorder and evil, something that needed to be subdued by the gods. They believed that these pagan gods were at war with the sea, but here, Yahweh doesn't battle the sea. He commands it. He commands it. He is showing and expressing authority over the sea with a word. He set its boundaries, telling it where to stop. Isn't that a beautiful thing about the sovereign God that you see in the book of Job? That even from the beginning, when Satan comes, like God's all over this story. He's like, have you considered my servant Job? And then even when Satan's like, let me at him, he's like, okay, yeah, but here's the limitations. I'm going to tell you where to stop. God's in control over this whole thing. And so here, what God's revealing to Job is like, hey, the sea, even the sea knows its limitations because I tell it to. This is a radical contrast to the myths of Job's time. Other cultures believed gods fought against the chaos, but the God of the Bible doesn't fight, he rules. And the sea's not a threat to him, it's under his authority. And so there's something unsettling about the vastness of a sea, right? When you stand out, maybe even in Lake Michigan, but you see the waves coming and you realize the sea doesn't care anything about my life, right? I can't just tell the wave to stop and it stops. It's just going to keep crashing into the shore. And you realize when you look at this vast sea sometimes just how small you are. And this, here, God speaking to Job, he says, I told the sea where to stop. The message, what terrifies you is under his control. You might go to bed at night tonight and you might say, hey, this problem befalling my life, this situation, this circumstance, whatever it is, it's too big for me, it's too scary, I don't have power over it. Be reminded that he does. Be reminded that he does. And so imagine standing at the sea that's beginning to have a storm. Anybody ever been on water during a storm? A few of you. It's terrifying. I only had one experience. I was in a 12-foot aluminum boat with probably a 12 horsepower motor, and I mean, I thought I was going to meet Jesus that day. But imagine standing at a sea at storm. And imagine a guy coming up and saying, hey, stop it. Hey, you winds and you waves, stop it right now, and it does. You would look at that person, well, you have so much power, so much authority that's so beyond me. And that's the story we see of Jesus in Mark chapter 4. When Jesus is getting his beauty sleep and gets interrupted from his nap, and he's like, really, and you know, it's like you almost, it's kind of a humorous kind of visual when you think about it. It's like Jesus gets awakened from his slumber because people are terrified of the storm. And you and I, we get terrified of our storms, don't we? And when we're crying out, and then Jesus just comes out, he's like, hey, knock it off. We're sleeping here. Right? That's the picture we get of Mark chapter 4. And so the same God of Job 38 who sets the limitations of the sea is the same God who tells the winds and the waves to obey me in Mark chapter 4. His power is over us. And so your storms are not sovereign. God is. Like if you miss everything else from today, leave with that line. Your storms are not sovereign, God is. They do not have more power than him. They do not have more authority than him. And not even death and the grave can hold him. That's the God whom we serve. And so the waves you fear most still obey his command. And if God can hold back the sea, he can hold your life together in the midst of suffering. The presence of chaos does not mean the absence of God. Just because life feels out of control doesn't mean he's let go of the wheel. Fear grows where we forget who's in charge. You will grow in anxiety and worry and fear when you forget who's in charge in the room. But if you believe your circumstance, your suffering, your pain is the one that's really sovereign, the one that's really in control, fear and anxiety will mark your life. But if you see the God who loves you and has laid down his life for you, that if you see that he's the one in control, oh, how perfect love can cast out fear. When I know that my Father, the one who holds all power and all authority in both heaven and on earth, is the one that's truly in control, I get to rest my head well at night tonight. I do. I don't have to weigh up worrying. And hey, trust me, I still will. I still do have stuff swirling in my head all the time. But fear will grow when we forget who's in charge. The sea may be vast, but is never outside of his hands. Remember back to Job 1 and 2, where Job acknowledged that where this whole storm came from when he says to his wife, shall we not accept the good from God, but also the calamity? He said, this storm has come through his hands. And so his power is over us. And lastly, God's presence is with us. This is verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. Here's what could have happened. I mean, there Job is, flustered, angry at God, pounding his fist. You know, God could have just said, hey, I'm going to let you keep having your temper tantrum, and then I'll let you figure this out eventually. But no, the gracious love of God comes, and God speaks. God speaks to him, not with a whisper, not with a soft breeze, but from a whirlwind. Again, we understand storms, right, from the ancient culture. And yet here in Job, the storm is not a sign of judgment. It's the place where God meets Job. I've said this before, but if you're newer here to the church, I wouldn't be a pastor today if it wasn't through the deepest valley of suffering in my life that I've ever walked through. God met me at Troy Beaumont 4 North. When I had what some theologians would call the dark night of the soul, when God felt distant and absent and I could not fathom or understand what he was doing, God met me there and he birthed a seed in me that would grow for ministry. That I had a hunger for other people to know the love of God, the goodness of God amidst suffering. And I'll tell you what, I'm 19-year-old, just kind of leaving the hospital, not understanding the life or the world and how it worked. I thought that I was a unicorn. I thought, hey, I have this testimony about suffering and trial, and I want to have my ministry mean that I care for people that are in the midst of trial and suffering, and I want to help them see how God can be good in the midst of it. And I'm like, man, it's such a niche ministry. And then you go and start talking to people, and you realize everybody suffers. Everybody walks through valleys and storms. And so it was like, okay, God, you just changed my perspective because now my ministry is really for everybody. That I want everybody to understand that God's good no matter what it is that you're walking through, and that if you place your stake in the ground and say, come what may, I'm yours, that he will hold. He's the firm foundation that can weather any storm. And so here he meets Job in the midst of Job's despair. God meets him. And this moment is crucial because it reveals something profound about the nature of God, is that he's not distant in your suffering. He enters it. Think about it. Job has spent nearly 37 chapters crying out, demanding answers, sitting in the wreckage of his life. When God finally speaks, he doesn't explain the suffering. I mean, if you're just the bystander to the story and you hear the story from beginning to end and you actually say, wait, God's going to speak at the end, the natural thought is probably, hey, he's going to make it all make sense. Hey, Job, here's why you lost all your finances and your cattle, and here's why you lost your kids and your home, and here's why you lost everything. But instead of that, that's not the roadmap that was given. What was given was himself. God gave Job a bigger picture of himself. And I've spent probably close to a decade trying to understand the goodness of God amidst suffering. Even wrote a little book on it. There's 10 copies at the desk that are just going to be a gift for whoever wants to read that. I want to make that just a blessing to you. And I've tried to understand, okay, God, what is it? What's the barrier? What is the hardest thing to believe and understand about your goodness? And I think one of the biggest struggles of faith is the silence of God. Because there's times where God stays silent. When we suffer, we assume he's absent. We assume that he's absent. We equate silence with abandonment. And that's hard to reconcile about a God that you believe to be good and loving. Hey, why would he abandon me in this hour that I need him most? But what if silence from God doesn't mean that he's gone? What if he's just working in ways that we don't yet perceive? What if it's like what he says to Job at the very beginning, and he says, hey, you weren't there when the chapter started. You weren't there when the book began. There's more to the story, Job. You weren't there. And what if I can just look at my life, and when it doesn't make sense, I go, okay, God, I guess I don't see it the way that you see it. What if he's working in ways that we don't yet perceive? God showing up in this whirlwind shows that he's never absent in our storms, even when we don't recognize his presence. I was thinking back to one of the first nightmares I ever had. It was Wizard of Oz. Not a kid's movie, right? I can just remember the Wicked Witch of the East, or was it the West? The West, nerds. What if, it's like you just see that as a 4-year-old. And you go to bed. I remember going to bed, and I just remember the witch chasing me up this tower, and I'm gonna get you, and and it's like, it was terrifying. I even heard the tune in my sleep, and I can remember just screaming out for my parents. And I remember my mom came in and just held me. It wasn't like, hey, that's just a movie. It's just not true, and. Think about a loving parent that shows up in that moment for that child. The loving thing isn't to give them a lesson about the psychology of fear. It's to simply put your arms around them and say, I'm here. I haven't left. You're not alone. I'm with you. That's the most loving thing God could do for Job. Because while the psychology of fear would be beyond a 5-year-old, God's wisdom is beyond ours. And if he tried to explain the why, if he tried to give all the nuances to what was happening, we wouldn't get it. The best thing that God can do for us is put his arms around us and say, I'm here. Daddy's here. You don't need to be afraid. I've got you. So that's what God does. He overwhelms Job with his presence. I'm here. I've always been here, Job. And this scene foreshadows what God will do through Christ and Jesus. That God does not speak just from the storm, but he enters it. The fact that Jesus entered our world, that's what John 1 says. John 1:14, that he came into the world and he made his dwelling among us. And so God doesn't just reign from the heavens. He meets us in the storm of our suffering. Even when he feels unseen, your pain is not ignored. The voice that created the world is the same voice that speaks into our suffering. The same God who spoke order into chaos in Genesis is the speaking over your life right now. Trust that even when God doesn't give you an explanation, he always gives you himself. Even when you don't see it, even when you don't feel it, he's there. And so the presence of pain does not mean the absence of God. Sometimes it's when he's closest to us. This is a hourglass toy. I got it from the Hansons. It's from their Indiana Jones game, but I just didn't have one of these in my house. But imagine your life and your suffering is like this. And it just feels like every situation, every thud in the road, every thorn in the side, every circumstance that you wish was gone just keeps piling up on you. Right? It doesn't, I think even the Bible concludes this. I think even the Bible teaches this, is that when it rains, it pours. Job chapter 1, when all of the messengers show up to Job, one after another, they don't even give him time to process, but it just feels like one thing after another. And for some of us, we look at it and we go, I don't know how much more I can take. I feel like I'm at the bottom and it just keeps dumping on me. And I feel like there's no way out. But that's all we see. That's all the perspective is that we have, is we're just looking up and it just seems one thing after another. And what we don't understand is that our lives and our circumstances are all in God's hand. And he gets to see it from a different vantage point. He gets to see it from a different perspective. But even the beauty about the fact that our suffering is not sovereign. This is not what's in control. The sand is being held. The sand is moving because of where I'm holding it right now. So who's sovereign, me or this? Me. I could change this on a snap of a finger. And if we could understand that our suffering is not sovereign, the circumstances aren't sovereign, but that God is the God that's outside of space, time, and matter, the God who holds the whole world in his hands. You know what the beauty that the Bible teaches about this? Is that God can work all things together for good. That God can flip suffering on its head. Why? Because he's the one who's in control. That's Romans 8:28. That God can work all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purposes. And so God looks at this way differently. And it's okay to understand that, hey, I don't understand. It's okay to say, hey, God, this feels really heavy right now, and I can't take it, and I can't change it, and I can't fix it. But if we could see how big his hand was, and we got to see how big his power was, and we got to see how big his authority was, and we said, no, this is actually in God's control. Do you see the invitation now is not to clarity, it's to trust. It's to faith. And the question is, do we see God big enough? Do we see him big enough? Because that's what God's invited Job into. He says, you weren't there, Job, when I laid the foundations of the earth. He said, Job, this is my story, and I'm the author. And you just have no idea what I'm doing, but if you could get a perspective, if we knew what God knows, we'd ask for the things that he gives us. I wholeheartedly believe that. And if you need any level of confidence that God's love is good and that it's for us, that it's been, that God has lavished his love for us, then we look to the cross. The cross is just this evidence. The fact that he got involved. The fact that he knew a solution to our sin problem and that he knew that he had the abilities to pay for it. And he went and he did it and he took care of our deepest need. Why? Because he loves you. Because the God of the universe loves you. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever would believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. That so is a volume, it is a measure of his love. He so loved you. So loved you that he stretched his arms as far as he could and he had them nailed there. that you and I might know the forgiveness of sins and the love of God. And so that's the invitation if you're just questioning, hey, how can I trust his wisdom? How can I do that? Because he's laid out his love for you in the most clearest way that he could. Greater love has no man than this, than a man were to lay down his life for his friends. Jesus has done that. You can trust him. Let me pray.